What is up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work to Game, and I wanted to talk about my initial thoughts on dungeon design for Shadowbringers. Now, we only got to see one dungeon at E3, middle of June. We will hopefully hear back. It sounds like they're fighting Tritania, so it sounds like they're going to get a chance at that first. I assume that's the 8-man content that we'd be getting, I would think, around mid-July. They haven't kind of announced any of that, but typically we would be, they haven't firmed any of that up, but typically we would kind of expect to see that a couple weeks into the expansion if everybody I've talked to and kind of my memory serves me correctly. And then Savage would lag right behind that. And so hopefully that'll give us a little more context still, but how did the new dungeon feel? Because there were a lot of changes around the new dungeon. Tanks have been drastically changed, healers have been drastically changed, a lot of the DPS classes have been drastically changed. We've of course had new jobs added to the mix, and then there's the dungeon design itself, because one of the things that Brian and I have said is before you decide if your job is broken or not, you really want to know how the content feels. For the fact that they said things were going to be interruptible, I was actually a little bit surprised that there wasn't just an overwhelming number of things to be interrupted in the dungeon. But maybe that's in future dungeons. We did run one of the lower level dungeons. I think it's meant to be the level 73 dungeon. But as far as DOS mechanics, they continue to surprise me again. There was basically a mechanic where there's these bars that you have to fill, and if you don't fill them, they buff the boss. You have to just stand in the way of them. And there was really simple to pick up mechanics, so for it being 73, it's like, hey, maybe there's a lot of returning players, so I didn't find it overly difficult. Hopefully it's tuned a little more difficult. In my mind, it would make sense for them to have tuned our build a little bit easier, because they would want all the press that were invited to be able to clear it, and I know that on our day, it was all streamers and things like that, and so literally there wasn't a single person in the room that wouldn't quantify how much they've played this game, in how many years they've been playing, and how many days of playtime they have on a particular job. We play a lot. I probably have the least playtime in that room, and I know that I've played this game a lot by the definitions of any non-14 player. But when you think about the fact that the press tour had like Kotaku there, and I assume they had things like IGN and stuff. We'll see when all these videos go live who all got invited, but it would make sense to me that you might have more journalists in the room, and so maybe the reason it was easy is because it's easy, or maybe the reason it was easy is because they tuned it down for us, because they did say those numbers of subjects changed. So I wouldn't worry about the difficulty at this point, because I just don't know. But I will say that tanking felt really good. I'm a little concerned at how much like a melee DPS it felt. I really wish there was, I kind of miss the enmity rotation. I think that there's something about that kind of like whack-a-mole game that you have of keeping up with enmity that was made a lot easier, because I basically tried it with the toggle off. So I tried not turning on the enmity thing intentionally, and it was really hard to keep thread on more than one thing, because I was basically a DPS trying to top the parser on each thing. And no, they didn't let us have parsers. And the moment I flipped that switch on and tossed out basically any AoE, it all really just fell into my lap. And so I immediately had full hate on everything, and it got really easy to maintain after that. I didn't have anything ripped off of me a single time after I was actually established with the switch on. So I do think it's going to be really easy to learn to tank, but I'm concerned for like career tanks, especially career tanks that come from other games and have come to this game and appreciate difficulty because they've got years of experience across multiple games, across multiple jobs, all these different things in tanking, that this will be a very light version of tanking. So hopefully it does at least lower the tank queues. I would assume that's the purpose of it, and hopefully with things like the stuns that they talked about getting added to the content, because you'll notice that they said the range DPS and the tanks would be responsible for it. That cuts melee DPS out, so that's at least something that tanks would be responsible for that melee DPS are not. I did like the way I could kind of toss out different defensives and stuff to my party, so that felt a little more like support role-ish. So that was kind of cool. It's going to take some practice being able to kind of target things. One of the things I do when I tank is I really stop paying attention to my party members. Like, basically, I want to know, do I have thread on everything? Once I do have thread on everything, I really want to just pay attention to where my party members are standing. And as long as I make things avoidable, the rest is really up to them. Like, I don't care after that. But this says, like, hey, if a tank does end up with, like, an ability that allows me to kind of help somebody out and toss things like that, it could be interesting to like help mitigate damage. So the way mitigation is going to be an interesting conversation, but I really don't know how to have it outside. I mean, as a 4-man dungeon, all it did was give me a taste, and I look forward to seeing what 8-man and 24-man content looks like. So I do think that that's really interesting. It wouldn't surprise me to see them kind of revisit or rebalance the way that limit break for tanks work, but maybe not. They could leave it the same. It feels like everything's up in the air right now. I will say that I tanked on Warrior and Gunbreaker. I did not try Paladin or Dark Knight. Brian tried both of those, and my initial thoughts were that Warrior felt the same and Gunbreaker felt great. Now healing, when I healed through the dungeon, if I'm showing any footage to it here, keep in mind I'm not a PvE healer. I've PvE healed in WoW as my raid main for several of the raids, and so when I came over 14, I kind of left that behind and wanted to try something different. Not too different, but a little bit different. And so like tanking is really still pretty new to me. And so ignore, like, I'm sure my rotation is suboptimal in this, but it still kept everybody alive. So I still didn't have any trouble healing people. We do still have damage meters on the bar. So as I went through this dungeon, I was able to help things along, and I was able to help kind of push things along to the point that I would run out of mana. So I will say that, like, mana is going to be something you have to be really aware of as a healer, but otherwise the new dungeon still felt like the old 4-mans. Healers can push the pace, things like that. I could even pull as a healer, because with the trust you kind of have to help push them along. They're not super aggressive about pulling. So overall, I would say the new dungeon felt like a continuation of the old in many of the good ways, and that if anything, it showed me that, you know, we don't need the class kind of cohesiveness to be any more complex than it is. We don't need Bard to be a class that Dragoons need, but we'll have to see how that tunes in the Savage content. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about my initial impressions of group content, and how the different roles are playing once they're in content together, because in my mind all this single player stuff is its own thing, but really the jobs are built around group play, around that 4-man, around the 8-mans. I look forward to seeing what the 8-mans look like. I'm a little interested to see what an off-tank's role is in the terms of the fight, because they're a melee DPS with, like, basically what sounds like they'll have like an extra stun and some defensives. The toggle flips, but it's on a cooldown, so if there is any tank swapping, you would be able to swap, because that timer's slow enough that you'd be able to do it for different phases. So tank swapping could be a lot more intriguing when you talk about new dungeon design. Healing, I feel like, because they know exactly how much mana we have, exactly how many casts that works into, if they can teach us not to DPS, they could make Savage content very, very aggressive on the amount of damage coming out, now that you've kind of, in theory, balanced all of the healers. We'll have to see how that works out. So they could, in theory, really push the amount of healing required to clear Savage and Ultimate content, which I think would be exciting to see. The conversation about should they be DPSing not even be a conversation, because, like, they don't have time to DPS. If they DPS, people die. And so I would love to see it move in that direction. Where Dancer fits into things will be interesting. It's not the amount of buffing that I think people are concerned it is, but it definitely has some buff to it. When you pick a dance partner, that's going to be a really pivotal decision. I do think that as we look at a lot of the way classes are interacting now, those, like, very direct synergies seem to have been removed, but there's still a lot of just in general helping each other out. So I do think that looking at things like parsers may get a little more difficult, because group comp is going to really affect the overall performance, especially when you talk about the party buff, that basically gives you a buff for filling certain roles. So making sure that you have a melee DPS and that you have a ranged DPS and that you have a tank. By the time you factor all that in, you could have two groups with the identical players switching up their group their job comp, and it could totally change their numbers, even if they were in the same gear and they were the same capabilities on those jobs. So I'm really interested to see kind of what the more aggressive community, the really high-end community ends up doing with this. I'm really interested to see what that first ultimate fight makes people think, as we start to have to struggle a little more to firmly theory craft. I'm sure people will figure out. I'm sure people who are a lot better at crunching numbers than I will ever be will figure all this out. But I'm just interested to see how long it takes that dialogue to form and what the meta decides the game is. So that's my overall impressions on this. If you guys have any questions about the new dungeon or anything like that, or group comps, definitely let us know in the comments below. We're going through a lot of videos and a lot of content, and I would love to share it with you. My name is Chris with Work to Game. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next time.
Hey Chris, your shirt's pretty looking.
You know, honestly, it doesn't have Work to Game anywhere on it, but I like to support the channel.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you know you can do that and also have a good looking shirt.
I don't really want that shirt. You think maybe it could be a different shirt? Well, cool. I think I'm going to click on one of the links somewhere around here, and I'm going to go see what we got.
Hello. It's really, really, really good.
You guys have a great day.
Take care.
You probably have a pretty shirt on.